movement that was taking place as an arts movement. In addition to the arts movement and political movement, there was a movement in terms of literature. You have, case in point, Langston Hughes. You have the artist Aaron Douglas that was engaged in the Black Renaissance. You have Jacob Lawrence. You have Ramir Burton. You had a lot of prominent artists that was engaged. In addition to prominent artists, you also had Black scholars that was engaged in the Harlem Renaissance movement and of political interest. Individuals like Hubert Henry Harrison, who was a stunt scholar as well. I came across this information as far back as Arts High School, in reading the book entitled World's Greatest Men in Color, the second volume. And at the age of 14, and in the second volume, if I'm not mistaken, page 451, I'm going off memory now, I read the essay entitled The Black Sherlock Holmes of History, and that was in reference to Arthur A. Schomburg, who's known as the Black Bibliophile during that particular time. The Schomburg Black Research Center is actually named after the Schomburg. The Carnegie Corporation purchased Schomburg's collection as far back as 1935 for $10,000. It was purchased by the individual Frederick Keppel, who was working for the Carnegie Corporation, and so that became which was with the 105th Street Branch Library during that particular time, that was ran by Ernestine Rose. And then so later years, because of the fact that there were so many different archival books, archival artifacts and pieces, it was important to take a lot of that memorabilia in those collections and create a center. And that case in point, you have currently the Schomburg Black Research Center to be able to house the collection, because when you're actually dealing with archival management, you have to consider that when you have in old newspapers and old files, it has to be at a certain room temperature. And if it's beyond that room temperature, you can damage great information and great memorabilia. Things that, information that can be considered priceless. And so it was later moved based on the interests of the public. And here you have the Schomburg Black Research Center. But in addition to Schomburg, during the Harlem Renaissance, you also had other individuals who was involved with collecting black memorabilia and black information. Henry P. Slaughter is another person. If you look at the Clark Atlanta, Henry P. Slaughter's collection is down there. Jesse Moreland was another individual who was involved, and Jesse Moreland was a black bibliophile. The Moreland and Spingard collection now is housed at Howard University. And so these people did some special work in terms of collecting information in reference to Pan-Africanism, in reference to the Africans in the diaspora, Africans that were prominent, those who were overlooked in terms of history. And a lot of the information that was collected helped to create a historiography for African Americans and Africans as a whole. And that's very important, because Schomburg had gotten engaged in wanting to understand black studies and black history and our place in it while he was going to school as a young lad in Central Tuce, Puerto Rico. And they said, he spoke to the teacher, and the teacher said, well, what about the blacks in history? Because, if you go to Latin America, you not only see people of Hispanic background, but you also see people of dark hue, because there was a miscegenation between the Africans, the Europeans, so on and so forth. And some of the people in that region was of dark hue. And he said, well, how can we not be a part of history, in terms of being black? So his quest for the rest of his life, after being engaged in the Cuban struggle, Spanish-American War of 1898, after being engaged in a lot of Latin American interests, when he came into America, once he was mentored by Johnny Bruce, he decided that he would dedicate his life to collecting memorabilia of black people throughout the world. and prominent blacks who actually made a difference.
So to look at him, you would think he was of Latino descent.
You would look at him and you would think he was of Latino descent and or African American descent,
Okay.
based on because there's a lot of.
But he considered himself African American.
He did consider himself.
He had no misconception or misunderstanding about his origins and his roots.
No, he considered himself a person a person of African descent, and he wanted to align himself in the interests of black struggle in the United States of America. In addition to being a person involved in African American struggle, he was also involved with Latin American interests when he first came into the country. But when he met Johnny Bruce, he decided that he would dedicate his life to African American memorabilia and black history.
Well, let me just go like today in our society, the climate is, really divisive. And when you talk about Schomburg, it just brings an idea to my mind that here is a guy who was inclusive of all peoples, to document the history of that people and to bring Latin, African American, and that whole diaspora together.
Yes, you can't talk about African history or history of the Caribbean and not include Latin America, not include European history, not include because it's miscegenated. It's so many different historical complexities because nature knows no color lines. So
yeah. But now knowing that, how has that particular history been excluded from the American history that is propagated on a regular daily basis, even right now today?
Well, if you look at American history today, if you look at the history in general, usually the victor gets to tell the history. If you look at historiography, the person that won the wars tell their version of the particular story. It doesn't necessarily have to be true.
So when the lion becomes the hunter, then he tells the story?
Well, so what happens is, and so it was of great interest to have a certain perception of black studies or black history, in terms of some people of European descent who was engaged in the commerce of slave trade or the slaveocracy in Americas did not want blacks thinking that they ever even had a history. And in case in point, you have Cinque, who said, when James Adams saying, well, who are you? What is your story? He said, well, he had to tell him that I'm from the Mandinga tribe, so on and so forth. So we have a history, but to actually extirpate that history and make it seem like there's no history of Africans, and that we were engaged in trade in China from Djibouti, or we wasn't engaged in world affairs, it's a misnomer.
Right, and this misnomer has been propagated on a regular daily basis. Now, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, it has. And I think the problem is that a lot of people think history is old, but I believe that history is past, present, and future at the same time. So when you really look at history, if you don't, when being mentored and listening to people like John Henry Clark, he said that history is like a time clock. It tells you where you're at geographically in the world today. And if you know your history, you can focus and you can discern the realities a bit more better because you have a starting point. But to say that blacks did not have a starting point is a major misnomer in terms of black history, black studies, and not just black history and black studies, but American history and American studies, because African Americans and people of African descent
is American history.
Is American history. So you can't say that you're talking about American history without including the reality that we are an integral part, the social fabric of American history.
Walter.
So I know I've been talking about education and African Americans not knowing the history for the last couple of weeks, and I was just wondering, since you were talking about how whites a long time ago they didn't want African Americans to know their history,